Hello, and welcome to the Cities of the Future podcast. My name is Naomi. I am a master's student in urban sustainability and resilience, and I study this at the University of Miami, and I will be your host leading today's podcast. Before we get into it, I just want to mention that accessibility captions are provided, and also a full transcript of the podcast is in the section below. The transcript includes the spoken content of the podcast to ensure accessibility to everyone. Having said this, let's introduce today's topic. As the name reveals, the aim of this podcast will be to explore the ways in which we can shape the cities of the future while being in a constantly changing environment in which elements like climate change and population growth put more and more pressure on urban living. In this episode, we will go into how zoning policies can shape development and what approaches to zoning can influence development positively to become more sustainable and resilient. We'll discuss this through the lens of Urban Terroir. Before you wonder, what is she talking about? Don't worry. I'll talk you through the concept of Urban Terroir first so you can get a clear and comprehensive understanding of all I'm going to discuss today. So, the concept of urban terroir. Let's get into it. Urban terroir is basically a framework used to understand how cities function as interconnected systems. The buzzword here is interconnected. I'll explain why. It's a holistic and data-driven way of looking at vulnerabilities in the built environment and thinking about how we can design more resilient cities in the context of climate change. The whole point of the framework is to understand that all actors, elements, systems, and so on are interconnected and are influenced by each other. It underlines the importance of viewing them as a whole system in which feedback loops exist. You can't just look at one element without influencing the other. The idea originally comes from the French winemaking, also known as viticulture. In that context, the word terroir refers to the unique environmental conditions in which grapes grow. I'm talking about elements like soil, climate, landscape, and the most interesting, that may be the most important one, is local cultural practices. You probably have drunk wine at least once in your life. Or maybe you haven't, but you know that there are endless different wines with different bodies of flavor. Note the word body, because the taste of a wine is viewed as a unique whole. All of these factors I just mentioned, soil, climate, etc., together influence the character of a wine. Winemakers can play with all those elements and how they influence each other to create the next unique body of wine flavor. Urban terroir takes the same idea but applies it to cities. It asks, how do the different elements and dimensions influence and interact and form the character of a place? So urban terroir really encourages planners and designers to take a place-based approach. This is where urban development responds to the specific characteristics of a location and sees how they can influence them in a way that really maximizes the sustainability and resilience of the area. This idea is the concept of hyperlocal identity and is based on the principle that nature and culture cannot really be separated, but that human and natural systems are deeply interconnected and should be viewed as a larger ecological system. This nurtures the idea of genius loci, which literally means spirit of a place. If you think about this approach, it actually makes a lot of sense in different ways. One example where they did the exact opposite is the history of the Everglades. During the 20th century, very large parts of the Everglades were drained in order to make space for suburban development and also agriculture. At the time, this was seen as a positive progress since it was going to make for economic development. However, the interventions dramatically changed the natural ecosystems that were working fine. The natural water flow of the region was totally disrupted, and over time this actually increased flooding risk and created major water problems. Today, Florida is investing billions of dollars to try to restore the parts of the Everglades ecosystem. This shows what can happen when planners ignore the ecological characteristics of a landscape. Instead of working with the natural systems, development was imposed onto it, and ultimately created long-term environmental and planning challenges. In this case, Urban Terroir argues that working with a place-based approach would have been way better. The framework also emphasizes environmental restoration. Instead of only focusing on development, like the main goal was in the Everglades case, it encourages repairing natural systems that play an important role in supporting climate resilience. Imagine if the Everglades were never touched and the ecosystem was still in place. Florida would have never had to spend millions of dollars to restore it in the first place. Thinking of these outcomes as the goals, Urban Terroir becomes particularly relevant when examining zoning policy, which plays a major role in shaping how cities grow and develop. This brings us to our next topic, the problem of traditional zoning. Zoning is a planning tool used by the governments to regulate how land in a city may be used. Zoning literally means that land is divided into different zones. Think, for example, of zones such as residential areas, commercial areas, or industrial ones. These rules determine and regulate what kind of buildings may be built in a place. Also, how densely an area may be developed, and sometimes also things such as building heights or parking standards. The thing is that in traditional zoning, only one function or one zone is assigned to a piece of land. This creates little to no flexibility. A good example of this can be seen in many American cities. In many suburban areas, zoning strictly separates residential neighborhoods from commercial areas. This means that people often have to drive long distances to reach basic services such as grocery stores or their workplace. And in many suburbs around cities such as Houston, Miami, or Los Angeles, residential neighborhoods, for example, consist almost entirely of single-family houses. Examples in Miami are, let's take Kendall. Large parts of Kendall are zoned almost entirely for single-family residential housing, while shops and workplaces are located along the major commercial corridors. Another example is the area around Doral. Many neighborhoods consist mainly of residential gated communities, while employment and commercial functions are concentrated in separate office parks and shopping areas. Imagine having to travel the same long distance for every time you want to go to a store or when you want to go to the gym. Another reason why this approach can cause problems from a climate resilience perspective is because it limits the walkability of cities and increases transportation emissions. Because the further the commute, the more emissions are made and the less motivated someone is to go and walk that distance. Another important criticism of zoning that should not be forgotten is that it has historically contributed to spatial segregation and inequality. Sometimes neighborhoods received more investment and environmental protection than others. Spatial inequality becomes especially problematic in the context of climate change. Lower income groups are often more exposed to environmental risks because of this. In addition, traditional zoning systems are often static. They assume stable environmental conditions and long-term land use patterns. Climate change, however, is an uncertain element and can cause dynamic changes in the environment. You think that, therefore, more flexible planning approaches are needed. Rigid zoning rules can limit the ability of cities to adapt to changing environmental conditions, which with increasing climate change is no longer a sustainable solution. If traditional zoning creates limited spatial structures, the question arises, what would a more climate-responsive approach actually look like? Here, the idea of climate-responsive development comes into play. Climate-responsive development refers to planning strategies that actively integrate climate adaptation into decisions about land use and urban design. Instead of treating climate change as a separate environmental planning problem, the approach tries to view climate responsiveness as an overarching dimension that should be considered directly into all planning decisions. This strongly connects to the Urban Terroir framework. If we understand cities as interconnected systems, as the Urban Terroir concept discusses, this means planning decisions should be made taking into account all of these relationships. In the literature, a distinction is often made between so-called fail-safe systems and safe-to-fail systems. Traditional planning and zoning has often focused only on fail-safe approaches. The idea behind this approach is to plan in a way that completely prevents disturbances. For example, by building large infrastructure projects such as seawalls or drainage systems that must withstand environmental hazards. But in reality, and from what we have seen in the past, climate change brings uncertainty and increasingly extreme weather events that cannot always be fully predicted or controlled. For example, ultimately, you can never fully predict the climate or the weather. So, in a certain sense, you could say that the fail-safe method can only reach as far as our ability to predict the future. Many planners today argue for a more adaptive approach. Instead of trying to prevent every disturbance, cities should be designed so that they can absorb shocks when they occur and then recover quickly afterwards. This is the so-called safe-to-fail perspective. If it goes wrong, we are prepared for it. From a zoning perspective, this means that we must move from rigid land use structures to more flexible and climate-sensitive planning. Urban Terroir specifically suggests that zoning should respond to the ecological and spatial characteristics of a place. In practice, this means that natural systems are directly integrated to urban development. Another strategy is adjusting development intensity based on climate risks. Instead of building the same amount everywhere, planners can reduce development in vulnerable low-lying areas and instead stimulate more efficient density in safer locations with better infrastructure and public transportation. A well-known international example that combines the two strategies together can be found in the Netherlands and is called the Room for the River program. Instead of only building higher flood defenses, planners intentionally limited development in certain flood-prone areas and gave rivers more space to expand during high water events. This approach shows how spatial planning can guide development towards safer areas while reducing environmental risks. Climate-responsive planning is therefore actually very promising. It does, however, need practice and fine-tuning in reality, because the next topic we are going to discuss are the challenges of governance and the financial picture. Climate adaptation investments require long planning horizons and coordinations between different institutions. Government bodies often operate slowly anyway, and especially when it concerns coordination between different departments and institutions. That makes smooth implementation difficult. On top of that, there are often significant financial resources to make this happen. Like everything in this society that does not immediately produce hard cash, it is invested in slower or can be seen as less interesting by stakeholders. Many planning systems are still based on short-term economic priorities. Money often goes to what seems as the most urgent. The problem, however, is that the paradigm must shift towards considering climate-responsive development as urgent. Another important factor is housing affordability. In many cities, including Miami, rising house prices and development pressure create a kind of paradoxical tension between economic development and climate resilience. Maybe you have already heard of what researchers call climate gentrification. Traditionally, the richer neighborhoods in coastal cities were often located directly at the water because of the view and the access to the ocean. But as sea level rise and flood risks become more visible, these areas are increasingly seen as risky locations. The higher elevated neighborhoods that are safer against flooding are now becoming more attractive for residents and therefore developers and investors. So naturally, housing prices then increase in those areas with the result that the neighborhoods become unaffordable to the original residents. The phenomenon of gentrification manifests itself once again, but now with climate safety risks as the trigger. Another thing that you often see in zoning decisions is that priority is given to economic growth or real estate value when this phenomenon occurs, instead of thinking about what is best for the long-term environmental resilience, which is almost never the displacement of the original residents. So it becomes clear that when zoning policy mainly focuses on short-term economic development, it strengthens spatial inequality and exposes vulnerable communities even more to environmental risks. Urban Terroir shows that zoning cannot be seen as a neutral planning instrument. If climate-responsive development is the goal, zoning policies must also reflect this. As we have discussed, zoning policies can do this by taking the ecological and social characteristics of a place as the basis in protecting them, instead of applying the same rigid land use categories everywhere. In summary, the Urban Terroir really emphasizes that these issues cannot be addressed separately. They must be understood as part of an integrated urban system in which planning decisions influence both resilience and equality. So, to wrap it all up, policy basically plays a very important role in shaping how cities respond to climate change. And the concept of urban terroir offers us an alternative perspective to traditional zoning systems. By recognizing the interconnected nature of elements and dimensions within cities, planners can develop more flexible and adaptive approaches to urban development. I hope everyone listening has developed a little better understanding of the urban terroir concepts and how it can be incorporated in zoning policy. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message on my university email. My name is Naomi, and I want to thank you again for listening to the Cities of the Future podcast. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.